Welcome back. So let's continue the audio reading from the story Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket. We're starting on page 126. Okay, so this is the last paragraph on the page. It says, out of utter necessity, knowing that any of these thoughts might be reality in the very next seconds, he was slowly able to shut his mind against every thought but what he now began to do. With fear-soaked slowness, he slid his left foot an inch or two downward his own impossibly distant window. Then he slid the fingers of his shivering left hand a corresponding distance. For a moment he could not bring himself to lift his right foot from one ledge to the other. Then he did it, and became aware of the harsh exhaltation of air from his throat and realized that he was panting. As his right hand then began to slide along the brick edging, he was astonished to feel the yellow paper pressed to the bricks underneath his stiff fingers, and he uttered a terrible abrupt bark that might have been a laugh or a moan. He opened his mouth and took the paper in his teeth, pulling it out from under his fingers. By a kind of trick, by concentrating his entire mind on first his left foot, then his left hand, then the other foot, then the other hand, he was able to move, almost imperceptibly, which means so slowly or slightly as to barely be noticeable, trembling steadily, very nearly without thought, but he could feel the terrible strength of the pent-up horror on just the other side of the flimsy barrier he had erected in his mind, and he knew that if he broke through he would lose this thin, artificial control of his body. During one slow step, he tried keeping his eyes closed. It made him feel safer, shutting him off a little from the fearful reality of where he was. Then a sudden rush of giddiness swept over him, and he had to open his eyes wide, staring sideways at the cold, rough brick and angled lines of mortar, his cheek tight against the building. He kept his eyes open then, knowing that if he once let them flick outward to stare for an instant at the lighted windows across the street, he would be past help. He didn't know how many dozens of tiny sideline steps he had taken, his chest, belly, and face pressed to the wall, but he knew the slender hold he was keeping on his mind and body was going to break. He had a sudden mental picture of his apartment on just the other side of this wall, warm, cheerful, incredibly spacious, and he saw himself striding through it, lying down on the floor, on his back, arms spread wide, reveling in its unbelievably security. The impossible remoteness of this utter safety, the contrast between it and where he now stood, was more than he could bear, and the barrier broke then, and the fear of the awful height he stood on coursed through his nerves and muscles. A fraction of his mind knew he was going to fall, and he began taking rapid blind steps with no feeling of what he was doing, sidling with a clumsy, desperate swiftness, fingers scrabbling along the brick, almost hopelessly resigned to the sudden backward pull and swift motion outward and down. Then his motion left hand slid onto not brick, but sheer emptiness, an impossible gap in the face of the wall, and he stumbled. His right foot smashed into his left ankle bone. He staggered sideways, began falling, and the claw of his hand cracked against glass and wood, slid down, and his fingertips were pressed hard on the puttyless edging of his window. His right hand smacked gropingly beside it as he fell to his knees, and under the full weight and direct downward pull of his sagging body, the open window dropped shudderingly in its frame till it closed and his wrist struck the sill and were jarred off. For a single moment he knelt, knee bones against stone on the very edge of the ledge, body swaying and touching nowhere else, fighting for balance. Then he lost it, his shoulders plunging backward, and he flung himself, his arms forward, his hands smashing against the window casing on either side, and his body moving backward, his fingers clutched the narrow wood stripping of the upper pane. For an instant he hung suspended between balance and falling, his fingertips pressed onto the quarter-inch wood strips. Then, with utmost delicacy, with a focused concentration of all his senses, he increased even further the strain on his fingertips hooked to these slim edgings of wood. Elbows slowly bending, he began to draw the full weight of his upper body forward, knowing that the instant his fingers slipped off these quarter-inch strips, he'd plunge backward and be falling. elbows imperceptibly bending, body shaking with the strain, the sweat starting from his forehead in great sudden drops. He pulled, his entire being and thought concentrated in his fingertips. Then, suddenly, the strain slackened and ended, his chest touching the window sill, and he was kneeling on the ledge, his forehead pressed to the glass of the closed window. Dropping his palms to the sill, he started into his living room, at the red-brown Davenport across the room, and a magazine he had left there, at the pictures on the walls, and the gray rug, the entrance to the hallway, and at his papers, typewriter, and desk, not 2 feet from his nose. A movement from his desk caught his eye, and he saw that it was a thin curl of blue smoke. His cigarette, the ash long, was still burning in the ashtray where he'd left it. This was past all belief. Only a few minutes before. His head moved, and in faint reflection from the glass before him, he saw the yellow paper clenched in his front teeth. Lifting a hand from the sill, he took it from his mouth. The moistened corner parted from the paper, and he spat it out. For a moment, in the light from the living room, he stared wonderingly at the yellow sheet in his hand and then crushed it into the side pocket of his jacket. He couldn't open the window. It had been pulled, not completely closed, but its lower edge was below the level of the outside sill. There was no room to get his fingers underneath it. Between the upper sash and the lower was a gap not wide enough. Reaching up, he tried to get his fingers into it. He couldn't push it open. The upper window panel, he knew from long experience, was impossible to move, frozen tight with dried paint. Very carefully observing his balance, the fingertips of his left hand again hooked to the narrow stripping of the window casing. He drew back his right hand, palm facing the glass, and then struck the glass with the heel of his hand. His arm rebounded from the pain, his body tottering, and he knew he didn't dare strike a harder blow. But in the security and relief of his new position, he simply smiled. With only a sheet of glass between him and the room just before him, it was not possible that there wasn't a way past it. Eyes narrowing, he thought for a few moments about what to do. Then his eyes widened, for nothing occurred to him. But still he felt calm. The trembling, he realized, had stopped. At the back of his mind there still lay the thought that once he was again in his home, he could give release to his feelings. He actually would lie on the floor, rolling, clenching tufts of the rug in his hands. He would literally run across the room, free to move as he liked, jumping on the floor, testing and reveling in its absolute security, letting the relief flood through him, draining the fear from his mind and body. His yearning for this was astonishingly intense, and somehow he understood that he had better keep this feeling at bay. He took a $50 from his pocket and struck it against the pane, but without any hope that the glass would break, and with very little disappointment when it did not. After a few moments of thought, he drew his leg up onto the ledge and picked loose the knot of his shoelace. He slipped off the shoe, and holding it across the instep, drew back his arm as far as he dared and struck the leather heel against the glass. The pane rattled, but he knew he'd been a long way from breaking it. His foot was cold, and he slipped the shoe back on. He shouted again, experimentally, and then once more, but there was no answer. Okay, so we're going to quickly summarize the following action. Again, considering elements of plot here. So it says, slowly through the panic, Tom is able to shut his mind against the horrific pictures he sees in his mind of losing his balance and falling. He painstakingly shuffles along the ledge, sliding his body along the wall. He stumbles, begins to fall, and grasps onto the window, which closes on him. He tries to get the attention of the apartments across the street, but no one sees him. He finally manages to punch through the glass and pull himself back inside. So I kind of went ahead of myself a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and continue on page 130. On the top, it says, the realization suddenly struck him and that he might have to wait here till Claire came home. And for a moment, the thought was funny. He could see Claire opening the front door, withdrawing her key from the lock, closing the door behind her, and then glancing up to see him crouched on the other side of the window. He could see her rush across the room, face astounded and frightened, and hear himself shouting instructions. Never mind how I got here, just open the window. She couldn't open it, he remembered. She'd never been able to. She'd always have to call him. She'd have to get the building superintendent or a neighbor, and he pictured himself smiling and answering their questions as he climbed in. I just wanted to get a breath of fresh air, so... He couldn't possibly wait here till Claire came home. It was the second feature she'd wanted to see, and she'd left in time to see the first. She'd be another 3 hours, or... He glanced at his watch. Claire had been gone 8 minutes. It wasn't possible, but only 8 minutes ago he had kissed his wife goodbye. She wasn't even at the theater yet. It would be 4 hours before she could possibly be home, and he tried to picture himself kneeling out here, fingertips hooked to these narrow strippings, while first one movie, preceded by a slow listing of credits, began, developed, reaching its climax, and then finally ended. There'd be a newsreel next, maybe, and then an animated cartoon, and then interminable, which means interminable, endless or seemingly endless. Scenes from coming pictures, and then, once more, the beginning of a full-length picture, while all the time he hung out here in the night. He might possibly get to his feet, but he was afraid to try. Already his legs were cramped, his thigh muscles tired. His knees hurt, his feet felt numb, and his hands were stiff. He couldn't possibly stay out here for 4 hours, or anything near it. Long before that, his legs and his arms would give out. He would be forced to try changing his position often, stiffly, clumsily, his coordination and strength gone, and he would fall. Quite realistically, he knew that he would fall. No one could stay out here on the ledge for 4 hours. A dozen windows in the apartment building across the street were lightened. Looking over his shoulder, he could see the top of a man's head behind the newspaper he was reading. In another window, he saw the blue-gray flicker of a television screen. No more than 20-odd yards from his back were scores of people, and if just one of them would walk idly to his window and glance out. For some moments he stared over his shoulder at the lighted rectangles, waiting, but no one appeared. The man reading his paper turned a page and then continued his reading. A figure passed another of the windows and was immediately gone. In the inside pocket of his jacket he found a little sheaf of papers, and he pulled out one and looked at it in the light from the living room. It was an old letter, an advertisement of some sort. His name and address in purple ink were on a label pasted to the envelope. Gripping one end of the envelope in his teeth, he twisted it into a tight curl. From his shirt pocket he brought out a book of matches. He didn't dare let go the casing with both hands, but with a twist of paper in his teeth, he opened the matchbook with his free hand. Then he bent one of the matches in two without tearing it from the folder, its red-tipped end now touching the striking surface. With his thumb he rubbed the red tip across the striking area. He did it again, and still again, pressing harder each time, and the match suddenly flared, burning his thumb, but he kept it alight, cupping the matchbook in his hand and shielding it with his body. He held the flame to the paper in his mouth till it caught. Then he snuffed out the match flame with his thumb and forefinger, careless of the burn, and replaced the book in his pocket. Taking the paper twist in his hand, he held it flame down, watching the flame crawl up the paper, till it flared bright. Then he held it behind him over the street, moving it from side to side, watching it over his shoulder, the flame flickering and guttering in the wind. There were 3 letters in his pocket, and he lighted each of them, holding each till the flame touched his hand, and then dropping it to the street below. At one point, watching over his shoulder while the last of the letters burned, he saw the man across the street put down his paper and stand, even seeming to Tom to glance toward his window. But when he moved, it was only to walk across the room and disappear from sight. There were a dozen coins in Tom Benecki's pocket, and he dropped them, 3 or 4 at a time. But if they struck anyone, or if anyone noticed their falling, no one connected them with their sources, and no one glanced upward. His arms had begun to tremble from the steady strain of clinging to this narrow perch, and he did not know what to do now, and was terribly frightened. Clinging to the window stripping with one hand, he again searched his pockets, but now he had left his wallet on his dresser when he changed clothes. There was nothing left but the yellow sheet. It occurred to him irrelevantly that his death on the sidewalk below would be an internal mystery. The window closed? Why, how, and from where could he have fallen? No one would be able to identify his body for a time, either. The thought was somehow unbearable and increased his fear. All they'd find in his pocket would be the yellow sheet. Contents of the dead man's pockets, he thought. One sheet of paper bearing penciled notations, incomprehensible.